regarding stories about hearing God's call. This one, from the book of Acts, when we look at it, it seems like Philip, the disciple, he's got it pretty easy. An angel of the Lord shows up, not something that many people get to experience, and not only speaks directly to Philip, but also gives very specific instructions, kind of like Google Maps. Get up, go south, on the road to Jerusalem, to Gaza. When Philip arrives at the destination, and he seems dumbfounded, he doesn't know what to do, he sees this Ethiopian eunuch, Philip gets another divine, that feels like a little divine interference, or it might be the AV guys back there, divine guide, when the Spirit shows up and spells it out for him. Go over to the chariot, Philip, and join it. The rest of the story is similar, with every step laid before him, so that he does not even have to think about what he is supposed to do. I would guess that most of us do not tend to have these kinds of experiences when it comes to hearing God's call in our lives. The Ethiopian eunuch, however, has a much different experience. From the description, we know that he is well-educated and an important person in the royal court of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. He handles all the money, so that's a big responsibility. As a castrated male, he was also considered a religious outsider, considered unworthy of even entering the temple in Jerusalem. That did not stop his spiritual curiosity, as Philip finds him sitting in the middle of the wilderness, reading the prophetic text of Isaiah, but not really understanding what it was all about. So when Philip finally gets his butt into the chariot, the eunuch does not waste time in asking for guidance. A quick study, he does not hesitate to take the next step, stop the chariot, and makes Philip get out with him so that he can be baptized. Before they have even finished getting out of the water, the Spirit snatches Philip away, and the eunuch goes on his way rejoicing, presumably back to his home in Ethiopia. I have a feeling that many of us would not mind a little more Philip-like guidance when we are feeling uncertain or confused about the direction of our life. Wouldn't it be nice to type where to find purpose in my life and have Google tell us to head south on Park Street, get on the Beltline, to the interstate, and take this exit to our final destination? Well, I do not doubt that there are times when God does specifically guide people. I think that this tends to be actually really rare occurrence. More often, we feel uncertain, confused by the myriad of paths, and anxious about making a wrong decision. The experience of the Ethiopian eunuch offers some reassurance and actually some specific things that we can do to better hear God's call, instead of just hoping an angel of the Lord will show up in our lives and give us step-by-step directions. It also provides reassurance of God's promises, which can calm our worries about making this wrong turn. It can be summed up in just 3 actions: reflect, ask, take a step. So first, reflect. In last week's sermon, Nee talked about how often we do not know ourselves well enough to know what God might actually call us to do. This might seem a bit odd, like, how can we not know ourselves? Well, actually, as students at a highly achievement-oriented university, it's quite easy to become so busy with what you are doing that you lose touch with yourself. So much of your time may be consumed by fulfilling academic obligations and extracurricular activities that there is really not much room for anything else in your schedule, let alone your brain. When your mind is constantly running and running through what you need to get done, upcoming commitments, it can be really challenging to hear God's call in your life. The eunuch, also a very busy person. As a high court official, official in charge of the Ethiopian queen's treasury, we can assume that it was an all-consuming job with really dire consequences if he screwed up. Well, there was some pressure. Yet he was intentional about setting aside time and space amidst the daily pressures to be still, to listen. In the story, we find him on his way back from a spiritual pilgrimage to Jerusalem and sitting in a deserted place so he could study scripture and think. Because this was likely a regular practice for him, he was able to start making connections between the story of who he was and God's story. Not without support, though, which brings us to his second action. As he was puzzling over this piece of scripture, perhaps a section he'd been pondering for some time, the Spirit brings Philip into the picture in such a manner that the eunuch recognizes him as a trustworthy guy. And so he asks for guidance to get perspective on the bigger picture. And many biblical scholars have suggested the eunuch saw parallels between the prophet's story that he's reading in the text and his own, both of them having been subjected to humiliation and injustice by others. Because of his sexual identity, he was not allowed into the temple, and he was considered this outcast, forbidden from admission into the assembly of God. But with Philip's help interpreting the text, the eunuch began to understand the good news of Jesus meant he was included in God's promises. He was released from an identity of oppression and empowered into one of joy and hope. Asking for guidance, not to direct our every step, but to help us see more clearly the story of how our life connects to God's, that is an important part of hearing the Spirit. We are not meant to lone ranger our way through the wilderness, figuring out everything by ourselves. We are called into community, where how we live is accountable to others. Having mentors you can trust in your life, that is an invaluable gift. You may wonder, how do you know if the spiritual guide is trustworthy? So I'll just tell you a few questions that I consider. How does the fruit of the Spirit, in particular love, show up in their life? Do they listen well enough to understand my story? And do they help me connect it to God? Who do they seek out for guidance when they need it? There is a person who doesn't think they need any guidance. Be wary. The answers usually tell me something about is this person trustworthy. But the bottom line is, we all need people in our life who can help us discern the bigger question in our lives. That's what community is for. And that brings us to the third action. Take a step. Sometimes we get stuck overthinking and asking so many questions that we become overwhelmed with information. Or we cannot see far enough ahead, and so we just take the path of least resistance, doing the same thing or nothing at all. There is a balance between reflection and action. And at some point, we are called to actually take a step of faith. We do not need to know the whole picture or the final destination. We do not need to worry about making a wrong choice as if there's only one right way. The idea that God has a specific plan for your life, that it is your job to figure it out, otherwise you'll be unhappy and unsatisfied, that's bullshit. It's a surefire way to live in constant anxiety and discontent. The truth is, there are many ways to respond to God's call, and that should free us to explore, trusting that she is with us wherever we go. When we look at how the eunuch responded to the guidance provided by Philip, we see that he simply took the next most logical step. Understanding God's promises were part of the story, he realized that baptism was just one way to mark that. And so as they meandered through the wilderness, he spotted some water. Not the impressive Sea of Galilee, not like the rushing Jordan River, just some random puddle of water out in the middle of nowhere. It did not matter, for he trusted the Spirit's presence was with him. So he got out of the chariot, he had Philip baptized. He did not need to know the whole story of how God would lead him. He just needed to take the next step. At this particular point in his life, it meant becoming aware of the water that was literally right in front of him, getting a little bit wet. Sometimes we spend a lot of time and energy looking around for a more impressive step that looks like jumping into the Sea of Galilee or the Jordan River. And we miss the unassuming water right in front of us. We are reminded by the eunuch's story to take notice of what is around us and take the next step. We do not have to have it all figured out. We do not need to know the whole route ahead. We can trust that God will be with us and step out in faith. Hearing God's call is not this mysterious endeavor. It's not a treasure hunt where you don't have the map for it. The eunuch's experience gives us these three practices that we can all implement. Reflect, ask, take a step. None of these are revolutionary. They are things that you already know. My guess is that the biggest challenge is finding space in your life to do them. So at Press House, as we told you, we have gatherings to encourage you in these practices so that you can become more in-depth at hearing God's call in your life. So instead of talking about this anymore, we're going to practice together right now. I'm going to invite Evan up in a moment, and he's going to guide us in becoming more present and aware of ourselves. That is an important spiritual skill that all of us can learn. If you've never done it before, don't worry if it feels awkward. That's normal. We lead mindfulness every Wednesday evening, right here in the chapel, I think. And I encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity to practice as a community. Doing this with others will encourage you to keep going until it becomes a regular part of your life. And I'm confident that with practice, you will better be the